Hi, this is Alex Vitale, professor of sociology at Brooklyn College, and welcome to the Critical Criminologist. Today I'm joined by Stuart Schrader, who's Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship at Johns Hopkins University. He recently got his PhD in American Studies from NYU, and before coming to Hopkins was a postdoctoral fellow at the Charles Warren Center at Harvard University. And we're here today to talk about his amazing new book, Badges Without Borders, from University of California Press. And welcome, Stuart. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Why don't you just give us a little brief rundown on what the book is about, and then we can talk about it some.
Sure. The book is about the history of the United States Overseas Police Assistance Program, which came into being in the 1950s and lasted into the 1970s. And the Overseas Police Assistance Program gave police training and technical assistance and material support to basically around 50 countries around the globe, mostly what we would have called at the time third world countries. And the book explores how this program of assisting police around the globe enrolled the kind of leading experts of American policing, the leading professional kind of trendsetters in policing. And it then, in addition to looking at what that program did overseas, the book then looks at how the experts who ran the program brought their experiences back to the United States, leading to Lyndon Johnson's war on crime or flowing into Lyndon Johnson's war on crime. And so I explore in the book a number of ways that the Overseas Police Assistance Program influenced the war on crime, in terms of producing new technologies, new technical repertoires, and supplying some of the personnel and ideological rationales behind the war on crime. So the book, it mainly covers the period of the 1960s, obviously a period of great social upheaval, where police were kind of at the center of a lot of social and political conflict. But it begins really at the end of World War II and runs up into the middle of the 1970s, looking at the kind of overall transformations of policing in the United States, law enforcement in the United States, through the lens of the global Cold War.
So often what you see is someone who's in the policing literature will make some reference to, foreign policy or foreign involvement with policing, or you'll see someone immersed in the foreign policies literature maybe mention something about the role of the police, but this weaving together of the two discourses at such a high level is extremely unusual. Did you start in one of those two camps and then find the connection and gravitate to the other? Did you realize how closely these things were connected when you started this?
I didn't know when I started. I had a sense that I was interested in figuring out the connections between foreign and domestic policy. I had that idea, and I had a sense that there was something to be discovered in terms of those connections by looking at policing, but I didn't really know how it was going to play out. The initial research process was halting and somewhat frustrating, and I ended up going down what I would consider a lot of dead-end pathways in the research process, in part because I thought that I should look in the military first rather than kind of in civilian policing. And so it was not easy to figure out how to do this, but I had a certain kind of inclination or disposition to keep trying to find those connections between foreign and domestic policy. And once I was able to start piecing together some of the connections, they kind of continued to reveal themselves in the archive. So what I mean by that is just to say that as I started the research, I started to notice, I kind of flipped back and forth between foreign and domestic archival sources. And I started to notice some names of individuals or institutions that cropped up on kind of both sides of that divide. And once I was able to identify those individuals and those institutions, then it enabled me to dig deeper and try to understand, why was it that I was seeing these people in multiple locations? Why were they on either side of this divide? And it took a while, but then, as I say, once I started to figure it out, those connections revealed themselves and started to become consistent. And ultimately, I kind of got to a point in the research where I really wondered why it was the case that I felt like I was discovering something that people hadn't written about. And of course, people have, as you say, written about this in different ways. And some of these themes have come up in other people's work, and some of the individuals that I examine deeply have been examined in other people's work. But I think it required a certain shift in my own perspective in order to figure out exactly how these connections were being developed in this historical period, and I just kind of had to follow the research where it led me, rather than starting out with a predetermination of where the research was going to go.
And had you previously encountered McCoy's work on the Philippines?
Yeah, I had.
That was important for me in my work in trying to make those connections that had sort of been talked about loosely. That was the first time that I felt someone was really concretely connecting the dots.
Yeah, and I had read McCoy's book on the Philippines, and it was greatly influential to me, remains greatly influential to me. And I actually saw him speak at an American Historical Association conference or something like that, and I sort of asked the question, which is in some sense at the heart of the book. In the Q&A, I just sort of said, like, well, you wrote about a very specific and discrete time period, and where there is a connection between foreign and domestic policing. What happened afterwards, and is the connection that you found, the same in the kind of later parts of the 20th century? And that's at least how I remember asking the question. And he answered in an interesting way, which was to say that, look, it was easy for me because I found this one guy, Ralph Van Diemen, who I could use as both the vehicle of sort of telling the story about these connections, but also the connections all flowed through him. It was an individual kind of story, and then he suggested that would not be the case in later parts of the 20th century. That's my recollection. This was a while ago. But I think that ultimately that transformation, and another way that I would just sort of put it, and this I developed in thinking about it in conversation with Julian Go, who also has worked on the Philippines, is just to say that, state capacity in the United States grew dramatically across the 20th century. Obviously, World War II really transforms how much state capacity the U.S. has, and particularly the rise of the national security state just creates a lot more possibility for these types of connections. And so, yes, it's true that in the period of the Spanish-American War and soon afterwards, we could look at a figure like Ralph Van Diemen and say, aha, the connection is in this one individual. When you get to
and maybe say just a little bit for folks, an example of what that connection looks like.
Sure. Well, Ralph Van Diemen was the head of military intelligence, which, before J. Edgar Hoover's rise to power, which really comes after World War I, Ralph Van Diemen, I think, a lot of people would have considered him the most powerful individual in the United States in terms of keeping a lid on subversion and political dissent. So he had been in the Philippines, and he during the Spanish-American War and in the aftermath, and then he comes back to the United States. And many of the techniques that what McCoy shows is many of the techniques he develops for gathering intelligence and exploiting it, using it to control populations, he brings back with him to the United States. And some of them are very basic technological innovations, like using something akin to a card catalog that we used to use in libraries, using index cards to keep data about individuals and so forth. So Ralph Van Diemen is where the transfer happens. He's the guy who brings some of these ideas to the setting of the Philippines, and then brings his experience back with him and continues to utilize it into the early part of the 20th century. And so then when you get to the post-World War II period, it's not quite as easy to just pin it all on all the transformations that occur on a single individual. Because state capacity has grown, it requires looking at kind of institutional and bureaucratic networks, and that's what I try to explore in the book. I would also say that one could probably go back to the Spanish-American War period and find a broader institutional fabric that Van Diemen was inserted into. I mean, he was a state builder. He was building state capacity himself. So I think that, McCoy tells the story through him, but I think there's probably more to be said about the growth of state capacity at that time. But certainly when we get to the period that I'm looking at, which is after World War II, the figures who are involved in intelligence, policing, counter-subversion, counterinsurgency, they're really trying to build somewhat more what I would consider anonymized repertoires. If we talk about the early part of the 20th century, it's like Ralph Van Diemen, J. Edgar Hoover, these kind of name brand individuals who want to get the credit for innovating.
O.W. Wilson.
Sorry.
O.W. Wilson.
Well, he comes certainly, and he comes a little bit later, but he's another one who wants to have his name attached to the techniques. He wants everybody to know his name as somebody who is a police innovator. The people that I mostly look at are the next generation, and my hypothesis, I don't really say this exactly explicitly in the book, but one of the reasons that I think they're so successful is that they don't so much attach a name to themselves. So, I look in the book a great deal at Byron Engel, who is the director of the Overseas Police Assistance Program. And he will say, I'm trying to bring the Wilson method to other parts of the globe. So he'll invoke Wilson's name, but he doesn't say it's the Engel method. He really wants not to be the focus of attention as much as some of these earlier figures wanted to. And I think part of that is about his own kind of personal disposition, but I think much more it's about really creating the bureaucratic infrastructure and state capacity for law enforcement techniques to become generalized and adopted without some of the kind of battling egos that I think thwarted some of that growth and adoption earlier in the 20th century.
You suggest maybe that had something to do with his humble Missouri background?
Well, it's a little bit hard to say, but I do think that there is something. I don't know if it's exactly because he was from Missouri, but he is somewhat self-effacing. He does inspire a lot of loyalty among the people who serve under him, Engel, but he's not an egomaniac, and a lot of the figures in the history of 20th century policing, I think, can fairly be called egomaniacs. I don't think that you can really understand some of the clashes between figures like Hoover, Harry Anslinger of the Bureau of Narcotics, Vollmer, Wilson, William Parker, all of these 20th century or mid up to the mid 20th century figures, they're all really trying to get the glory and the spotlight for themselves. And I think this changes in part because professionalization is meant to create these highly replicable techniques for policing. So you don't need one type of leader. So in that sense, somebody like Wilson basically creates the conditions for liquidating his own fame by making these literal textbook techniques. He writes the textbooks of mid 20th century policing, and then once everybody adopts them, nobody necessarily needs to think of them as Wilson's techniques anymore. And certainly, what Engel tries to do is bring those highly replicable policing techniques around the globe, and the way to do that includes just simply translating Wilson's textbooks into foreign languages. And so the Agency for International Development spends a bunch of money on translating standard police textbooks. That's one of the ways that they produce this and disseminate this knowledge.
One of the things that becomes clear in the book that I'm sure some people find counterintuitive is that, like in the context of the Vietnam War, the reliance on policing strategies is actually a more progressive strategy than the, bomb them back into the Stone Age strategy. And so then we take that same technology, though, and we bring it home, and we, in that context, we more quickly see it as problematic, as domestic counterinsurgency.
Right. Yeah. This is one of the interesting aspects of this history that I was not really expecting. But as you say, the policing techniques that the United States is trying to bring to third world countries are meant to prevent the outbreak of political upheaval, civil disturbances, or revolutions. There's really a continuum in the minds of these counterinsurgency experts from political agitation that is relatively benign, that we would understand as in the United States, protected under the First Amendment. They see a continuum from that to overthrow of the regime, and they want to make sure that they act in the kind of early part of the continuum. Policing is meant to prevent the outbreak of political unrest, and it's very much meant to be preventative.
And this is like a history, though, of policing, right? Is that it was a less invasive, real-time, community-embedded alternative to relying on, let's say, the military.
Exactly.
To deal with either colonial projects or other kinds of exploitative regimes.
Exactly. They will consistently say, unlike the military, who live in barracks, are drawn from across the country, the police basically live in the areas that they police. They're drawn from the populations that they police, and therefore they're going to be much better at gathering intelligence and information, at noticing when something is going awry, because they have a certain kind of familiarity with the areas, the neighborhoods, the villages that they're controlling. And when it doesn't work, when it fails, when the process is unsuccessful, that is the kind of signal of a lack of success, is the outbreak of political insurgency, is the outbreak of very serious forms of unrest and political violence. And so the history of a situation like what happened in South Vietnam is that basically from 1954, basically in the immediate aftermath of the signing of the peace agreement, which the United States never really holds up its end of the bargain, but the U.S. is trying to send assistance to the government in South Vietnam to help bolster its police forces. And it spends from 1954 all the way through 1963, 1964, basically a decade of continually bolstering the policing capabilities of the regime. In the process, the regime starts using those policing capabilities for really strong political repression. And that political repression incites more and more political rebellion and destabilizes the regime. Now, many of the people in the national security bureaucracy who are thinking about counterinsurgency, who are committed to using police to preventing insurgency from breaking out, they see what's happening and they understand it quite well. They say, look, we're trying to use police to avoid brutality, to avoid stirring political tensions, but
to help win over hearts and minds.
Exactly. And yet they're stuck in this paradox, because on the one hand, even if they want to introduce these progressive policing techniques that will create better conditions for the police to gather intelligence and so forth, they're also giving them to a repressive regime that does not want to share any power. And what goes along with it is continually giving them more and more arms, more and more implements of repression, and simply just expanding the number of police that exist. So South Vietnam has basically one of the greatest increases in the size of a police force in the history of the world. They go from a few thousand to over 100,000 police in a decade, all because of the United States assistance for this. So ultimately, by the time you get to the Kennedy administration, you have an outbreak of a real civil war type situation, and then the Johnson administration, of course, sends troops. Now, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that this effort to use police to prevent the outbreak of insurgency or civil war failed. At the same time, that doesn't mean that the United States doesn't stop giving assistance to the police in South Vietnam. They continue with this program. So at the same time that you have, aerial bombing going on across South Vietnam, the use of napalm and all these really horrific things that we know about, at the same time, you still have police in South Vietnam getting trained by U.S. policing experts in how to do the most basic kind of traffic stops, searching cars for contraband.
Criminal investigations.
Exactly. Gathering basically census information about populations, because the idea is if you know how many people live in a village, you can tell if suddenly the population number changes. Well, that might indicate that there are guerrillas coming into the village. If you notice that a family suddenly has an increase in their wealth, well, that might mean that they've been paid to give some kind of support to guerrillas and so forth. So the police are used to keep tabs in that way on the population with the idea that will help to control the guerrilla insurgency. It doesn't quite work, and in response, the United States really throws every type of military instrument that they can at the problem, which also doesn't work. I mean, ultimately, neither the military nor the police are able to solve the problem that the United States is trying to solve.
Well, that's a kind of classic, liberal misunderstanding about the nature of the problem. It assumes that we put in a benevolent technocrat and use data-driven solutions that just ignores the way that the corruption and exploitation is baked into that relationship.
Exactly. And I think that one of the interesting things when you go back and look into the archives of this period and how people in the national security state were thinking about this and how they understood the problem of insurgency, or as they called it, wars of national liberation. Of course, that's what they were so terrified of. I think that some of the people were pretty savvy about this problem, but they they were just caught. There was no easy way to, on the one hand, assure that various newly independent countries would remain loyal to the United States, would remain capitalist, and on the other hand, prevent the growth of, what we might call in kind of social scientific terms, anti-systemic movements in these countries, because the process of the emergence of capitalism and the development of commercial ties with the United States engendered a lot of the exploitation and political repression that caused people to get upset in the first place. So there's no easy way out of this challenge for the United States if they want to maintain loyalty, they want to maintain capitalist social relations, because capitalist social relations entail exploitation. They entail underdevelopment, in the term that many would have used at the time. And so they use the national security figures try to use police to keep a lid on the tensions, but they're caught. On the one hand, the police are able to keep a lid in some ways on the tensions because they're used to gather intelligence, they're used to neutralize movements, but then movements are constantly changing their techniques. And so, the public safety program, the police assistance program, really starts out mostly concerned with trade unionism and industrial strike action and so forth. And this is in the moment of increasing developmentalist projects across third world countries. And so there is new industrialization happening. Labor unions are growing in their strength. But the United States is giving, on the one hand, police assistance to tamp down these labor movements, and on the other hand, there's other types of assistance through, the AFL-CIO and various other, kind of labor channels to try to control militancy within these unions. Ultimately, in my view, what happens is that a lot of the militancy within unions in many of these countries is neutralized and controlled, some of it literally just through the assassination of trade union leaders in places like Guatemala and so forth. But then this just leads to new types of militancy. It means that left-wing radicals take on new tactics that are outside the traditional kind of repertoires of labor contention, and they start to go into either rural or urban guerrilla type techniques. And so then the police assistance program has to kind of retool its approach. But I think it actually is quite slow to realize how rapidly the movements themselves are shifting in response to political repression. The repression creates new opportunities and new exigencies for movements. And then the people who are behind the repression have to reevaluate and rethink. And I think generally they're a little bit slow on the uptake. The only thing that actually works in their favor is their paranoia and fear. So they do get ahead of themselves sometimes simply because they think that there are communist subversives lurking behind every corner. And so there probably aren't, but because they are worried about that, they do get ready for that possibility and bring to bear resources on the problem even before it might exist.
I think the domestic version of this kind of liberal conundrum and fallacy is the belief that we can fix the problems of American policing through these procedural reforms, community policing and restoring trust and legitimacy in policing. And this, of course, was one of the main motivations for my recent work, is trying to counter this idea. Because it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the institution and its role in these larger questions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would just say that Badges Without Borders examines the global field testing of exactly that type of liberal reformism. It goes back to the middle of the 20th century, and I do think that it would be fair to call a lot of the figures I look at liberal reformers. They believe in the power of police reform. They're not exactly willing to admit that police are causing all of the problems, but they do recognize that there is a necessity of reforming and upgrading police. That means, what we would consider, technical reforms to procedures, but also adopting a lot of new technologies. And what's so interesting when you look in this period, in the United States, a lot of the police agencies were basically as underdeveloped as police agencies in third world countries. The adoption of new vehicles, the adoption of new radios, the elevation of training standards, all of that stuff that was happening in third world countries through the police assistance program was also happening in many towns and even rural areas across the United States. So these are happening basically simultaneously, and what I show in the book is that they're being spearheaded by the same individuals who are all really engaged in a single conversation that is a global conversation. It's both domestic and foreign, where they are trying to figure out, okay, how can we put into place liberal reforms that will increase the technical capabilities of police wherever they are. And so that dream has existed for a really long time. And I think one of the great maybe tragedies of it, as you look at it up into the present, is that there remains this commitment to believing that technical reforms will solve the problems of policing, even though we now have decades upon decades of evidence that is global that shows us that that's just not the case.
Yeah, you add that global element to like the work that Naomi Morikawa did, showing how this played out in a strictly domestic framework. And so in that way, incredibly valuable, both in helping us understand U.S. foreign policy and its relationship to domestic policing. You mentioned Julian Go earlier, whose work I recently added to my own contemporary theory syllabus. And I think, we have to understand the ways in which both domestically and internationally these systems of social control are closely tied to racial projects, whether they're colonial or domestic. And how do you explore that in the book?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I spend a fair amount of time in the book trying to sort out, and it's complicated. But the main thing that I would say is that a lot of the liberal foreign policy elite and the liberal policing elite who I look at and whom I show to be in dialogue and conversation, they're quite aware that at the end of World War II, there is a transformation in the way that racism will operate going forward. Liberals want to redefine racism. They basically want to define it down so that they can think of themselves and broadcast themselves to the world as not racist. So what that means is that the defining down of racism, it's a familiar story that I think we would probably understand quite well in our own lives, which is to say that if people avoid racist language, if they avoid outward bigotry, if they express interest in cultural diversity, then we can't think of them as being racist. We can remove the accusation of racist intent. If that's possible, then we can remove racism overall.
Give them some implicit bias training.
Exactly, exactly. So the reason that this becomes so popular at the end of World War II is basically, I guess it would be threefold. One is that, of course, the defeat of the Nazis really makes it so that the type of avowed state racism that the Nazis represented, of course, is completely off the table. Another piece of the puzzle is that the Soviet Union is now in competition with the United States and is vying for allegiance of the large parts of the globe that are inhabited by people of color, the darker nations in Du Bois's term. And the Soviet Union has done a fairly good job of presenting itself as open to cultural diversity and supporting the independence struggles against imperialism of a lot of these places. And that will continue through the 1960s. And so the United States, therefore, wants to make sure that that possibility of allegiance with the Soviet Union is not strengthened by continued open racist policy on the part of the United States. And this is a huge challenge because it's still, Jim Crow is still in effect in the United States. There's, African American newspapers as well as Soviet newspapers are happy to highlight all the ways that racism is persisting in the United States. And so that leads to the third piece, which is that there is ongoing struggles from below by Black people and other folks against racism in the United States that are really putting a spotlight on the continued existence of racism. And much of the most kind of spectacular examples of it come at the hands of police. So these three factors come together to help the foreign policy establishment, and of course other scholars have looked at this. Mary Dudzik has the term Cold War civil rights, which is a really good way to think about it. But I think one of the things that I've tried to show in the book is that it's not just, in her work, she's looking at kind of the diplomatic corps, the people in the State Department. What I'm trying to say is, of course, that's true, but at the same time, we also look at the policing experts. They're talking to the diplomatic corps, and they're thinking in very similar terms. And it's a great paradox that the United States, the leadership of the emerging national security state in this moment says, we're going to use police to ensure that there will be a new liberal racial covenant where police are going to be the bearers of this kind of official anti-racism, where they will now be the ones who are going to be most conscientious about avoiding outward, bigoted language and so forth. That's a truly peculiar set of historical circumstances, given what we know about how police have been for decades by that point, if not longer, the strongest enforcers of the color line, the strongest enforcers of racialized social control in the United States. So this is a pretty large shift that happens at this moment. And I think, as you suggest, it continues to shape the way that liberal police reformers think about their relationship to racism, which is that it's not about the structurally, systemically, and materially unequal relationships that police are enforcing and are empowered to maintain. It's about whether they do that with an air of cultural sensitivity, and that is just that it's just not just a problem. It's a reflex that we need to find a way out of, because and it won't come from within police, because this has been a consistent approach from police for so long. The only way to break it is for people, I think, outside to to press and say, this has been the foundation of the maintenance of an unjust system of policing for such a long time that we need to get rid of it. We need to come up with something totally new, because reform is what got us to the point where we are today. Reform is what got us to all of the problems that Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, highlighted in great specificity in the last few years.
Well, that's really the core, right, of the police abolition argument in its more sophisticated forms. And I always say, you know, we're not going to end the racism of the drug war by giving narcotics units anti-bias training.
Exactly.
You know, it's built into the mission, and we have to get rid of narcotics units. That's really the only way we'll ever make any progress. We got to get rid of the war on drugs, etc. Now, I know you're active in the American Studies Association's Prison Studies, Critical Prison Studies Caucus. Mm-hmm. Have they embraced this police abolition analysis widely within that caucus? Because I found, for instance, in criminology, there is a prison abolitionist movement that is not really engaging the police abolition work that's going on, either academically or in the streets, if you will. I mean, they're not hostile to it, but they've sort of made a point of separating themselves off for that. So there is some tension in there, I think.
Yeah. I think in the American Studies Association, there's a bit more openness, but I would say that the way that the conversation has developed was that there was more focus on prisons and incarceration, and that has shifted over time toward including conversations around policing as well. I mean, the great thing about American Studies is that bringing U.S. empire or U.S. foreign policy into the conversation is not that difficult to do. I think people in American Studies are primed to make those types of connections, and for that reason, it's been a very congenial space for the type of work that I'm doing. And I do think that there are a number of us who increasingly are talking about policing and talking about empire. And so last year at the American Studies Association meeting, we had two panels. One that included, it was basically all people who had new books out in the past year or two. And so one was about people who were talking about policing and U.S. empire, and then one was people who were talking about policing, but mainly in the domestic frame. And so two full panels of, something like approximately 8 books or something like that. There's a lot of really great new work.
It's keeping me busy.
Probably a bunch of those books are in your pile. But yeah, it was me, Nicole Siegel, Marisol Lebrun, Max Felker-Cantor, Kelly Lytle-Hernandez, yes, Carl Sudler, and Simon Balto, and maybe there might be somebody else who I'm forgetting. But so it was a great set of conversations, and I think that kind of shows where the field is going. At the same time as the conversations around prisons and incarceration are also continuing and are still ongoing. But I do think that shifting toward policing is certainly where the field has been headed. And given that all of these really amazing books came out in the last year or two, I think it shows where the field is at. Now, where it's going to go going forward, I'm not really sure. But I do think that given that a number of us are trying to find ways to talk about U.S. empire and policing in the same conversation, whether it's Marisol's book about Puerto Rico or my book and Nicole's book, which have some affinities, and we both look at the Office of Public Safety. I think that this, or maybe I shouldn't say I think, I hope that this will mean that scholars going forward will really try to take seriously some of these connections between colonialism or empire and policing and prisons, rather than just kind of assuming from the outset that if we're going to talk about policing, it should necessarily be a sort of domestically focused or locally focused study. And that's not to say that people shouldn't do those types of studies, because there's really amazing work to be done in that way, and that is coming out now in that way. But I think that it's becoming a bit more understandable that this is a viable research pathway to go down, and that there are a lot of questions still to be answered about this.
I spent a couple of days with Nicole earlier this spring in Bloomington, and was impressed how much of a kind of active abolitionist culture there was on the ground there, and had a chance to connect with people in the harm reduction movement and folks working on homelessness and other issues. And have you been able to connect with folks in Baltimore? I know you haven't been there a long time, but what's the situation there?
Yeah, I've made a little bit of a connection. There's definitely ongoing movements, and probably the last thing they need is a guy with a PhD from New York City to show up and tell them anything. So I've mostly been in the kind of observational mode. But yeah, there's a lot of really impressive work. I mean, I think that, what of course makes Baltimore stand out among cities in the United States is that on the one hand, it does have a high homicide rate. On the other hand, it also has an extremely illegitimate and discredited police force. I think that those two things are deeply intertwined and connected, and we can't really talk about one without talking about the other. Also, Baltimore, of course, as we know, had an uprising about police violence in the aftermath of the killing of Freddie Gray by police. So, we're 5 years out from the uprising, and I think actually a lot of people, until the, quarantine and coronavirus, a lot of people were anticipating that there would be a number of commemorations and events of the 5th anniversary of the Freddie Gray killing and the uprising. I don't know what's actually going to happen now, but certainly there have been conversations about kind of assessing where are we 5 years later. And I think in general, a lot of people who were quite active think that the situation has not improved from the perspective of city government. On the other hand, I think there are a lot more activities happening on the ground in terms of violence interruption and restorative justice. And there's, I think, a lot of people, made a commitment to shift into that type of activity. And there are, new organizations that, 6 years ago did not exist and now exist, and now are consistently active on the ground, trying to, find non-carceral and non-penal approaches to dealing with some of these social problems. I mean, Baltimore is an extremely segregated city. It has extreme levels of wealth inequality. As my colleague Lester Spence often will say, people will call Baltimore City a poor city, but that's not exactly right. Baltimore City has a lot of wealth in it. It's just extremely unevenly distributed, and the wealth oftentimes is siphoned off, and it remains in these sort of either residential enclaves, or it's kind of it evaporates into tax subsidies for Fortune 500 companies and so forth. So there are a lot of conversations happening in Baltimore City about these issues, and I think a lot of people have a very clear-eyed understanding of what's at the root of the problems, and are really working hard to even change the ways that conversations, both in activist and in kind of everyday circles, happen around these issues. But it's hard because of course the media in the city generally is oriented toward the outlying counties, and if you watch the local news in this city, I mean, obviously the local news is fear mongering in every place, but the local news in Baltimore City is really on a nightly basis just trying to stir up fears of the violence and degradation that occurs in Baltimore City, as if the economic inequality and extraction of wealth that's occurring is not, making the existence of rich gated suburb communities possible in the first place. So
that's all erased. Yeah, that's all
exactly.
Erased. Yeah, completely insane. So, and I enjoyed the conversation that you and I were a part of with Lester a few years ago, where we tried to sort some of those things out, and been trying to follow from afar a little bit what's been going on down there. What's the reception been like to the book? And people using it in classes? Are you hearing about any of that?
Yeah. Actually, it's been great. It's been great. I've been really really pleased and very fortunate to have received a positive response. It has been adopted in some classes, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. I've Skyped into some graduate classes as well as undergraduate classes to talk with students, and it's been really fun and of course very edifying for me to have people talking to me about the book. I mean, I think in general, the book really ends in the 1970s. It is a historical account, and a lot of the conversations that I have with folks, both in person and virtually, people want me to kind of extend the analysis up to the present. And, I do my best to do that. And, but I also think it's important to recognize that the end of the analysis of the book comes because something dramatic changes in the way that the connection between policing and U.S. foreign policy works. The book ends with successful social movement activism to shut down the Overseas Police Assistance Program. It's a really remarkable and I think underappreciated experience in social movement history, the peace movement and the anti-imperialist movement that was during the period of the war in Vietnam, where this program became publicly known. People were really mad about it, and they convinced Congress to do something about it, and so they shut it down. At the same time, that created the possibilities for its extension in new forms. And so showing how that successful cessation of the police assistance program also created the conditions of possibility for its rebirth in new forms. And those new forms were primarily in the private sector, in the for-profit sector. That's what I think the conclusion of my book kind of indicates how we need to think about what comes next. The United States government does get back into the business of providing police assistance to other countries around the globe, and that's a very complicated story. But also a lot of private corporations start taking up this work, and as I show it in the conclusion to the book, some of the people who start these private corporations that still exist to this day, they're the public safety advisors who are working overseas when the public safety program gets shut down, and they basically just say, okay, we're going to keep doing the work. We're no longer getting a paycheck from the US government. That's fine. We'll incorporate, and now we'll get the paycheck from our corporation, and it's going to guaranteed be a much bigger paycheck in the process.
That's a central theme, of course, of McColl's book as well, is privatization of that security apparatus. Yeah. So what are you reading right now, or what have you read recently that you want to recommend to folks today?
That's a good question. Right now, I'm Well, I'm working on an article that's kind of like a prequel to the book that's about the police in the United States during World War II and the connections between police and military during World War II. Basically, we don't know the exact number. I'm still trying to figure it out, and the research is challenging. And now that the National Archives is closed, it's even more challenging. But we don't know how many police entered the military, but I think it's definitely tens of thousands. And then we also don't know how many military veterans became police after the end of World War II. But again, it's tens of thousands. So I'm trying to research that and figure out some of those interrelationships between police and military during the war, which of course was a really transformative moment in almost every aspect of American society. And I think it's interesting that, I've never read anything in the secondary literature that talks about its transformative effects on policing. So that's what I'm working on, and so I'm doing a fair amount of reading around that in my spare time, which right now because classes are not happening and the campus is closed, it's a little hard to know what's spare time and what's any other time. But I'm reading Saidiya Hartman's new book, which interestingly does delve into policing in a lot of ways, because she's interested in the ways that young Black women felt the effects of the coercive apparatus of the state in the early part of the 20th century, and how they understood what was going on and how they responded to what was going on. And it's a really incredible book. And I have a giant stack like you have behind you, probably with some of the same books in the stack as you have, which I'm anticipating getting into sooner rather than later.
Great. Well, Stuart, I want to thank you for taking some time out to share some of these ideas with us today. And if you get a chance, folks, to get out there and get a copy of this amazing book, again, from University of California Press. I don't know, is there an ebook version?
Yeah, there is. There's an ebook version and paperback.
I notice a number of publishers are offering discounts or even free access to some ebooks now. So it's an opportunity to download a lot of stuff on your phone now. All right. Well, good luck, Stuart, and I'll talk to you soon.